I'm Paulette Roby, and I serve as chair of the Civil Rights Activist Committee, home of the Foot Soldiers. This organization was founded by Tommy Wren, who was a field staffer for Dr. King. Tommy wanted a place for the foot soldiers to tell their stories so that we could collect their data and share it with our communities. And we came together in this organization. Our mission is to do those things and to preserve the history. I myself is one of those thousands of children who marched with Dr. King back in the 60s. I left Elmwood High School, got arrested, was put over at Fair Park Arena. I continued to struggle. I left Birmingham in '69, moved to San Diego, came back to Birmingham in '86. I saw a big difference from when I left Birmingham. I joined the struggle again, and I'm here today to continue.
What does matter is the letter from Birmingham Jail. Why do you think a piece such as that letter was so important in that moment, and why is it still important today?
Because of the treatment that was, when Dr. King was jailed and put into, what is it? He was put into solitary confinement. I feel the treatment the way that he was treated in the jail during that time caused him to write that letter. In fact, my uncle was jailed with him, and I remember how he came home and told us how there was a white man who was jailed and they had beat him so, and how Dr. King talked the guard into getting him some medical help. It was on Good Friday, and listening to my uncle tell us that story of the things that Dr. King said to the guard, and it made him open up that cell and get the man out and get him some medical attention. So I think it was because of the treatment that made him write that letter on the toilet paper. He had nothing else to write it on. So it's important that you know your history. If you know your history, you know who you are. And in order for you to know who you are, you got to know your history. That has to be done.
What's up, y'all? Welcome to the Black Voters Matter podcast room. Welcome to another episode of Unnamed and Unbound. And we are so excited about the topic that we are talking about today and the guests that we have. What are we talking about, Natasha?
So today, we think about movements, and there's always a strategy behind movement. There's also spirit, and it's really at the intersection of those things that we tapping into our humanity and really being able to have a strategy behind that is part of, I think, the blueprint of how Black people have always approached movement building in this country. And so today we're going to have a conversation about prophetic voice around how do we use this particular moment to build a movement that is rooted and centered in humanity and in love and really in strategy. And so we're going to be discussing the letter from Birmingham Jail by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. that I think is still appropriate and instructive of what we do in this moment. How do we gird ourselves in this moment to prepare and address what's happening? How do we really root ourselves in love? And how do we have a real analysis around where we are and how we're being allies to each other or not being allies to each other?
And we can't, there's a lot of people out here that study Dr. King, teach Dr. King, all of that, but we can't think of anybody more appropriate to talk to about this than our two guests that we have here today, and especially our good friend here, Dr. Bernice King. How are you doing?
I'm doing wonderful. How are you all?
We are great.
Great.
So happy to see you.
All right. Glad to be here to have this discussion.
Yeah, we're looking forward. I can't wait to have this discussion.
And also joined by Captain Charles Alphin, who is one of the trainers on the curriculum around the letter from Birmingham Jails and some of other Dr. King's other teachings, and somebody who worked with, my understanding is worked with one of our mentors, Dr. Bernard Lafayette.
Oh,
Yes.
Yeah. So welcome.
Well, thank you. This is certainly my honor to be here and share information with you, because I think that this can clarify a lot of things that people have misinformation about direct acting, especially in Dr. King's philosophy as a whole. Thank you.
You know, we know that the future has a past, that Dr. King's letter from Birmingham Jail was a prophetic guide on power and love, protest and liberation. And I think we have to really root and explore that and take back where, when we're thinking of this moment, we have a blueprint. There are things that have been done throughout our history that have always pushed us forward, not just as a community, but also as a people. And I think it's important for us to really unravel what were the anchors of what Dr. King was talking about in his letter. And I know I revisit and I read it periodically. I'll pull up and read it. And what was interesting to me recently is really around time. It made me think about time in a different kind of way. He talks about time and the timing, and at the point in the letter, he was talking those who were criticized, was it the right time? And I know that that's a question right now. There's a question in our community. Right. When is the right time for us to protest? When is the right time for us to organize? When is the right time for us to stand up for injustice? And so I think that he has a salient answer in that I know we will discuss. So I'll turn it over to you, Cliff.
Oh, okay.
Yep.
Well, on that point, it's important to even recognize the historical context. Like, why was he in a Birmingham jail at that time?
Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth, whose organization, the Alabama Christian Movement for Human Rights, was an affiliate of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC, that my father was the president of. And they were dealing with issues of segregation of public accommodations. And, at that time, people saw my father as kind of the main voice for the movement, and wanted to call him in to kind of amplify what was happening, because there was a lot of violence coming against the community that was seeking to challenge this kind of segregation. And so that's important for people to know. He was invited in, because I know we're going to get into the letter, but, he was accused of being an outside agitator, and he clarified so eloquently for them why he was not an outsider, because he had that relationship. But also because, in the Christian sense, we say the earth is the Lord and the fullness thereof. You cannot be an outsider in a world where we're all interconnected and interrelated, and where injustice lies, because the daddy said injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And so he was there, and they were protesting and demonstrating. This was before what people saw later on as when the children, the D-Day, when the children walked out of school and they marched to the park there, and we saw the water hoses and the billy cups. So this was prior to all of that. Right. My father decided, and my understanding is he had to pray about it, because as the leader of the movement, they wanted to make sure that he remained out so he could keep articulating what needed to be articulated, and also concerned about the fundraising efforts if they got locked up and didn't have enough money to get everybody out. So he actually went in a room and prayed. And the next thing they know, he emerged with his, what do you call those overalls and his boots ready to go. But there was an injunction against them for protesting. And he made a conscious decision to violate that injunction, which gave context to the whole notion of why they broke a law, which was raised by those clergy members. So realize when he wrote this letter, he wrote it like Paul from a jail cell, and he was in solitary confinement. Usually he was locked up with Reverend Abernathy, but on this occasion, he was in solitary confinement. He had no periodicals, no dictionary, no books, no nothing. He was coming straight out of his mind, heart, soul, and spirit when he wrote this letter. And so he was responding to 8 clergymen, including one rabbi, who was criticizing him basically around the demonstrations. They felt like there was another way to do this without having those public demonstrations. I don't want to go too far because I might go through the whole thing. I'm
No,
going
you
to stop
fine.
right there. But that's why he was in Birmingham, to help with the issue around segregation and public accommodations.
You know, I think that's powerful. In the letter he talks about, he actually mentions that. He mentions about laws where there are just laws and unjust laws.
Exactly.
And that it is a moral responsibility, that you have a moral responsibility to challenge unjust laws.
Yes.
And so just the hearing of, and it's interesting, I think the other piece that was interesting, he mentioned, and it wasn't until later, I remember when I first got introduced to the letter, in school, in high school, I didn't have the kind of the full context of it. And so in my mind, I was thinking that that was something in isolation. What I did not know is that it was actually in response to they had negotiated that Dr. Fred Shuttlesworth and others had actually tried to negotiate it, and there was some agreements that were made that the white business and they reneged on it. Yes, that sounds quite familiar, doesn't it?
It sounds like the Target situation.
That's right. So why don't we pick up there? Because you talked about the just and the unjust laws, and he even goes deeper into like helping us understand. Because you just say, yeah, there are just laws and unjust laws, and people are like, well, what does that mean? And so he goes even deeper and breaks down like what some of the criteria are for how you figure out a just versus an unjust law. I know one of them he talks about is an unjust law is a law where the majority imposes on a minority, but which they don't themselves, obey,
Exactly.
Hold themselves accountable.
Right, hold themselves accountable to.
Yeah, I'd like to just echo what Dr. King is saying, but also in his leadership in that room that he was talking about, Dr. King's leadership was to listen. And half of his staff said, don't go to jail, and the other half said, go to jail. And that's when he prayed. So that's key in leadership is that Dr. King was not impressed on leading and leading. He was listening to both sides, and they call that what we call the thesis, antithesis, and then the synthesis. So there's truths on both sides. He was really apt at doing that, and that's was a sign of his leadership, and also supporting other people, his staff that supported him. But the just and unjust law is sometimes very hard to understand because policemen back in biblical time and also in the 60s and even now, they use their force to support unjust laws. And like Mississippi was a police state, the police power of enforcing unjust laws. So that conscious what you feel is right. And Dr. King was dealing with personalism. He said any law that lifts up the human personality is just. That's
right.
And that was powerful, and most people don't understand that just law is morality. And Dr. King said this philosophy is excellent in morality and also practically sound. So it's morality given, but it's also practically sound, and that's why we can do it today because there's nothing old-fashioned or antiquated about this philosophy.
So just to further iterate, and an unjust law degrades human
That's right.
Human personality, destroys, damages human personality. So the just law has to kind of cohere with the moral law. Somebody said the law of God, so to speak. And anything that's not in alignment with that is an unjust law. But you can also have a just law that's applied unjustly.
That's right.
Like, when they were using the denial of a permit, so to speak, to do the demonstration and the protest because they were protesting against the anti-segregation laws. So we're going to deny you because you are protesting that. That's an unjust application of the law. And that happens, oftentimes today, as we know.
And this was not the first time he was confronted with an injunction. In Selma, they decided not to violate the injunction. And that was a strategic thing. So a lot of this has to do with strategy and thinking and timing. And some people don't know. You just can't apply this in every situation. You have to understand what's appropriate in this situation. In Birmingham, he violated, but in Selma, he did not violate that injunction.
And so I think it's important, too, for people to understand when you're dealing with injustice, you really have to, the steps of nonviolence are so important, but if they're not grounded in the principles of nonviolence, which is the spirit of nonviolence. And we can talk a little bit more about that. But you have to do information gathering to find out, you know, what is a just law?
Right.
You don't just want to break a law
Right.
because you don't like it.
Right.
Because it could be just. I mean, there's nothing unjust about having a permitting process.
Right.
There's nothing unjust about saying, you know, you have to gather here as long as it's applied fairly.
That's right.
You know, so we need to think about that when we are entering into these moments and making a decision so that we know whether we are actually breaking an unjust law versus a just law that's applied justly. Because you don't want to step over the line into breaking a just law that's applied justly, because then you have broken the law and you may not have the same support and backing in that situation.
You know, he talks about, I think it's interesting, he talks about I'm going to get into the letter, and he talks about the kind of the 4 steps, and he talked, I think the first step is the gathering of facts, the collection of facts, the second step is negotiation, the third step, which I really am really intrigued and interested, is around the self-purification, and the fourth step is around direct action. And so, you know, I think it's really interesting, because I think sometimes, even now, people get hung up in the moral context. And so there have been those who have been, I would call them the Confederate Christian Church, that have exploited this whole idea of really around passing judgment, around using laws in such a way that it excludes or does not acknowledge the humanity of others, and it becomes a twisted piece. And because of that, I know that there have been young folks and others who have actually moved away from believing that we have to lean into, that we still have the right to lean into a moral frame. And the moral frame is really rooted in this idea of all humanity matters. Exactly. And so I just really wanted to hear from you in terms of when as he was talking about self-purification, like in this moment, as we're preparing or as communities are organizing to respond to this moment, how is that applicable now, you think?
Well, you know, just to give a further context too. So after my father was assassinated, my mother, through the King Center, developed the 6 steps of nonviolence. So there are now 6 steps, because even contained in the collection of facts, you have to educate the community. And so it was, even though he didn't explain that, when you really studied him holistically, we determined that there was some other steps there that were happening to undergird the 4 that he had. So when you get to this self-purification, even though he states it in a certain order, for him, it really was about immersing yourself and preparing yourself to remain in a disciplined, nonviolent posture throughout the whole process, whether you're talking about going into a room to negotiate, or whether you're talking about going in the streets to protest and demonstrate. In fact, in Birmingham, they had to sign a pledge. It was a 10-point commitment card, and the first thing on that card was meditate on the teachings of Jesus Christ daily. 7 of the 10 were actually spiritual disciplines. And so this really is as much about your mind and your emotions, and more so about your spirit. And making sure that your spirit's right, and that you stay focused on the outcome. A lot of times we get sidetracked by the individual doing the injustice. And so in nonviolence, the spirit of it is, we're not trying to destroy that person. We're trying to defeat the injustice. That's why in Montgomery, when they went back to the buses, he had to prepare people so they wouldn't go back to the buses like, how you like us now? We got you. He said this was not a victory over white people, because he felt like white people were victims of a wrong thinking, you know, and so we're liberating them too in this process. So as we go back, they have to adjust to this, you know, new way of relating to us. And so we want to still maintain that kind of self-purification, disciplined posture. Now, a lot of people mistake that because they feel like you're being weak and you're being, you know, you're dismissing injustice. No, you're preparing your spirit so that your spirit takes precedence over what you might be feeling and experiencing in the moment when you come up against some injustice and some cruelty. And when I tell you that's a whole nother world, when those people sat there at the lunch counters, those students, and they could sit there and with this, you know, inordinate strength that you can't describe from any kind of human ability.
Right.
It has to be spiritual.
It has to be.
You know, it's a moral foundation, and folks spitting on you.
Yes.
And because today we like, nah, you ain't spitting on me.
Right.
But we forget we're in a movement,
That's
and in
right.
a movement, you know, it's different than when you're dealing one-on-one and somebody's attacking you. Because Daddy never, and I wanted to clarify this because this comes up often when we're having these trainings around nonviolence, period. Well, you know, what about self-defense? Well, in a movement, you have to be careful on the self-defense road because this is about preparing yourself in advance, knowing, and when you talk about civil disobedience, it's willing to accept. Am I willing to accept the consequences that come with my sacrifice now? Whatever that is, whether that's jailing, whether that's coming up against violence, am I willing to accept blows without retaliating myself? And so, you know, this, for Dr. King, I can't speak for other schools of nonviolence, but in Dr. King's nonviolence, the spirit is much stronger than the tactics.
From the resistance and the discipline.
Yes.
And I think I
Discipline
just
your
want to highlight
emotions.
that because I think part of it is that it's not just protests in the moment. They were trained.
Oh, yeah.
They were prepared.
They were.
It was highly disciplined, and it wasn't just about the action. It was also the spirit and the intent, the intention of the action as well.
And that made it so successful because the Nashville students, Dr. Lafayette and Diane Nash and Bevel, the training that Dr. King sent Jim Lawson to teach the youngsters in Nashville. And so that training was necessary when they joined Dr. King. The other students were not trained, so they didn't understand the philosophy and the preparing of yourself. That's very critical. It's a training. I've been transformed from violence to nonviolence by the King Center and Ms. King, Dr. Lafayette, and so I had to get inside myself. The first thing nonviolence changes is you. And then you have that philosophy, and that the strategy fits on top of the wheel, the philosophy, and that keeps you grounded and also has the borders around what you do and what you don't do, even in direct action.
And that seems to me missing sometimes, the training you keep talking about. Everybody's passionate. Everybody experiences the injustice in a different way, either directly or indirectly. But if we're not trained appropriately, then we can end up changing the narrative in the conversation. Right. We got to keep it on the injustice and not on us and our actions and things we did that may have hedged on being more violent. And violence is not just physical, it's your tongue. And that's the hardest part of it. How do I discipline my tongue when I'm in the midst of these confrontations? You know, because I know that was very tough when, for instance, when they were in Ferguson, and probably tough even now when people are coming, that you don't cuss them out, that you don't call them names, that you don't, because what happens is, instead of the creative tension that the direct action is supposed to bring to the surface, you know, the conversation changes about the violent confrontation and the words and the exchanges and the blah blah blah, and then we lose the real issue.
You talked about that creative tension, right? And that creative tension is so critical, you know, for at least two of those steps, the negotiation and the direct action. You know, people sometimes act like those are opposites, or like they're not related. Like either you're negotiating or you one of these rabble rousers out here doing direct action. And I think one of the things that Dr. King explains in the letter is the way that those are part of a continuum, the way that the direct action creates this creative tension that helps the negotiation to be more successful, right?
But it is important to note that if negotiation has never happened,
Right.
in some form or fashion,
Right.
then direct action may be out of order. Because the whole purpose of direct action is to
leverage.
put the it's leverage,
That's
and put
right.
the pressure on people to let's sit down and let's have a conversation. These are the demands. This is what we are insisting, because you don't compromise on injustice. You can compromise on timetables as long as they're not unrealistic, but not on injustice.
That's right.
That's such a powerful.
Also, the negotiations in Kenya nonviolence are different than labor negotiations.
Okay.
So your goal in negotiation is to produce a win-win. because you get into that reconciliation and the beloved community. So that negotiation has specific things that's different from normal negotiations where you want to take everything and leave that person nothing. So it is really powerful when it's done right.
So, thinking about, because part of the reason that we're doing this new initiative that we're doing together,
Right.
this series of workshops, is to help with this grounding in terms of what's going on today, right? And I'm reflecting on that piece of like the negotiation and the direct action, because there are some folks that would say, how do you negotiate when the thing that you're negotiating with is whether our lives even matter, right? Like, what's the win? Like, let's take it in today, and how we would apply it, because that's what a lot of people watching are going to be thinking. Like, how do we apply this?
You know what I think we miss oftentimes? This is bigger than the parties involved.
Mm-hmm.
I want people to hear that.
Mm-hmm.
There are other parties out there who may have connectivity to the people who may think that way.
Mm-hmm.
There are other parties that we need to continue to build the movement, to win them into the movement. And so while this individual may be the one who has that perspective, there's so many people out there that if we have the right discipline and posture, may be an asset becoming, I don't like the word allies. Some people say co-conspirators or whatever, because ally to me sounds like you doing me a favor or something.
Right.
When this
I
is
agree.
injustice against humanity, so
That's
you're
right.
not doing, it's for all of
It's for
us.
all of us.
So,
That's an excellent
but those individuals, there's some people that can reach them. So you also want to use nonviolence to attract those people to the movement who may be in the room and see this and speak in that person's ear, who may have influence.
Right, because I think that's why I go, my favorite part of the steps when he talks about, and I really has been pushing my thinking around the self-purification piece, because there's a part of it that really is about you operating at your highest and best self. Like, it's not just a matter of you waiting on other folks,
Right.
that there's this
Yes, but-
belief that if I and the collective are operating, we are operating in our highest and our most integral selves, that there's something in terms of righteousness in that space, that there's something transformative in that process. There was something really powerful you said, that the first thing that has changed in nonviolence is you. We want people to hear that part of, even as I'm saying it right now, I got chill bumps. Part of this, the idea of nonviolence was never for people to feel move in a space, and I think it gets misconstrued sometimes of weakness or surrender. It was
Right.
always operating in your core power, which is a space of righteousness in your humanity.
And that word passive resistance came from Gandhi in South Africa, and he changed it to satyagraha, meaning love force, because that passive seems like you do nothing, turn the other cheek, and all this out of misconception. So that's very clear. It's very important people understand that. And also, the 6 steps came from, like Dr. King said, Mrs. King and Dr. Lafayette and others at the King Center, I was being trained, came up with the 6 because they're in there. I think the 4 steps came from the Fellowship of Reconciliation. They only had 4. And self-purification was changed. I think we were doing a prison grant from the federal government, and they were concerned that self-purification was too religious, and they changed it to personal commitment.
Personal.
There are folks thinking about this now, watching this now, that say, civil disobedience was dangerous, right? In 1963 in Birmingham. Some would say even more dangerous today, right? And so, what's the case that we are to make to folks today in terms of how we apply all this, knowing that we've got somebody who literally just a few years ago wanted the military to shoot protesters, right? And so, what's our response to somebody watching this right now that says, you know what, I want to negotiate, I want to go through self-purification, I want to get to the win-win, I want to be in the street doing direct action, but like how do I account for this moment that we're in?
Well, in Ferguson, they were doing things that was out of the spirit of Kenyan nonviolence, and we had to help them understand. So there's 181 things you could do according to Gene Sharp of the Einstein Institute in Harvard. So you have to be specific about what are you trying to achieve and what's the condition. So every boycott marching. In fact, in Cobo Hall, when Dr. King marched in Detroit, they were saying that protest without policy is performance. So we have a lot of performance because they don't have a connect with Dr. King did. So you have to make sure, number one, you connect what's legal and what's not legal, because since the 60s, the opposition has learned too. And some protesters are out of character with what Dr. King was doing. So first of all, you need an attorney to tell you, I don't want to get a felony. I want misdemeanors and I want misdemeanor. I want city ordinances. So tell me, what do I do? Because in Ferguson and also in Rodney King, we went out in Rodney King, California, they were doing things that were contradictory to appeal into the conscience of the people to get involved, because you can't fight the police and throw Molotov cocktails and say, come join us. The United States people, that won't do that. So your direct action has to be appropriate to what you want to achieve, and that's strategic. It takes learning, it takes practice, it takes being involved in a movement.
And one of the principles is really about that, and it goes in line with personal commitment, self-purification, is nonviolence believes that suffering for a just cause can transform.
Can be transformative.
Yes. And so it is counting that cost starting out. That's why I said civil disobedience, Daddy said it in the letter, openly, lovingly, and willingness to basically pay whatever the consequences or costs are. And I think sometimes we enter into this not going through that. That's why you keep focusing on it, because people are like upset because they got arrested. Well, that's a decision you make before you get into direct action.
Right.
You know, am I willing to pay whatever the cost is in this? You have to ask that.
Right.
If you're not, then maybe your role in the movement is not on the ground in terms of protest, demonstration, etc. Everybody has a role and a place. In fact, you don't want someone who's not disciplined, has not been through that process on the ground. And too often that happens because we're all passionate about what's happening. And we kind of have zoned in on the only way we're going to change it is if all of us get in the streets. That's not true. Because some change can come about at that negotiation table. You know, some things can be handled just in the information gathering process, because misinformation leads us in the wrong direction as well.
Right.
So,
some,
you know,
some are done in the courtroom, right? Like,
Yes, exactly.
You know, as I know,
Lots
you
done in
know,
the courtroom.
the Montgomery bus boycott.
Yeah,
People think
it wasn't
was
the boycott.
Right.
It was the Supreme Court decision.
That's right. That's right.
And the boycott didn't influence the justices.
And
You know, I do want to say something in terms of protest, because Dr. King does say in the letter that I think it is natural, even when we're talking about the Ferguson and others, it is natural for people who are oppressed to literally like go to the point of protest, whether it's structured or not, right?
Oh, yeah.
And so he actually mentions that in the letter around we're at this stage, but what the natural stage to happen can be something very different. And so I think it's very natural for people to respond that way. I think that's why it's so important that those of us who really believe in this as a strategy, we've got to find, and I'm excited that we're doing this training, we've got to find ways that we're literally introducing and putting the infrastructure in place for people to actually, who are frustrated, who have the right to protest, who have when they don't have anything else to really respond that way.
And it has become a channel for anger.
It's a channel for anger.
It's a channel
And
for
it's natural.
frustration.
Yes.
Yes, it's very natural, and that's why he introduced it, because he said, "How can I rechannel, you know, people's emotions and energy, rightful, you know, emotions and energy around this into something that's constructive."
That's right.
But it's right. We got to get to the trainings, because again, and again, this is what I say. I'd rather, as long as there's some kind of understanding that we have to have some kind of, you know, appropriate restraint in our process, I'd rather have somebody doing that to rechannel than not, because people are going to need somewhere to express themselves.
Absolutely.
You know, but until we figure this out, how people can understand this whole process, that's going to keep happening. So that's one of the reasons that I'm glad we're doing this, so that people know now, oh, we need to go through this first, and perhaps there's already been negotiation going on with some of these things. Even if we weren't the direct parties, it has happened. You know,
Right.
and I don't. This is not about that conversation, but that's part of the issue around Target. People, these promises were made.
Right.
Right.
People are, there have been black producers and of products and stuff, and they've been at the table with the people, and now all of a sudden, so now how do we get you to a table to say, hey, we got to restore some of these things and go even further?
Right.
So we've mentioned a few times these trainings, right? These workshops that
Right.
we're going to do. So let's talk about that just real quick. So we've got a series of, right now I think it's 6 that we're planning to do together, right? I think 3 are going to be virtual, meaning anybody out there, y'all can tune in and get this. Y'all got a whole PhD,
I know that's right.
a whole graduate level education right here. And so some will be able to do it virtual, and then there are going to be some that'll be kind of
In person.
in person and hybrid. And so people can come and see us in person and again get this whole graduate class from. So we're really excited
We
about
are,
that.
and I don't want to be alarmist, but we've got to really understand. I think that part of, even when you listen to Dr. King's letter, he understood the urgency of that moment.
Yeah.
And so we have to also recognize the urgency of this moment. We have to get prepared that the space that we're seeing, this isn't about a political party or candidates, but what is wrong is wrong. And what we're seeing right now is we're actually seeing the denial of rights. We're seeing our anti-blackness. We're seeing racism and sexism and all of those things, which means there comes a time that we're going to have to stand up in more risky ways, and that it is going to require us actually in many ways to become ungovernable. And so in order to do that effectively as a strategy, we've got to really study the strategy to get that done. And so this
Now,
is
clarify
yes.
for me what you mean by ungovernable, so they don't take that to the wrong side. Because I can hear
It
somebody.
is okay.
Legal disclaimer.
We have to get to the point that we are standing just as those in 1963 were willing to get arrested
Exactly.
around challenging unjust laws. That's what I mean. That we've got to get to the space where we are willing
To break unjust
unjust laws,
Yeah.
right? But in a way that is highly disciplined. Because what we also know is that in other, when we've seen attacks on democracies in other authoritarian countries all around the world, people, those movements that lasted were movements that were really rooted and sustained in strategy and spirit,
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
And so we have to realize this isn't the moment because let's be honest, for years we've had, we protest. That's part of the
Right,
culture in America is that we protest, right? But in many ways, our protest has been really kind of defined I don't want to call it just performative, but it's been very, sometimes
It's
has
been
been
without
but it's
strategy.
been without
I'll say that,
strategy. Oftentimes, not all the time, but oftentimes, it's been in a response to something. And so part of where we are right now, and the risks are getting much higher. And we're actually seeing some of those same tactics of those who sought to oppress us from the 60s. We're seeing that now in terms of the police being, we're just seeing different elements of that. And so for us, I think it's important for us to recognize that it's not just an exercise, even though it would be good enough historically for us to root ourselves, but we really need this strategy in this moment.
Especially now when, the federal government has backed off.
Right.
Back then, we were
Yes.
facing those state forces.
That's right.
And we had kind of an avenue to the federal
To the
government.
federal government.
All of that
Right.
is
What does that
problematic
mean?
today, particularly if you're in states that are dominated by those who are aligned with that agenda, the legislators who align with the agenda of the current administration's practices. So, yeah.
Because when a federal
That's absolutely important because the Department of Justice has eliminated the civil rights
That's right.
Right.
approach. They're going after people who violate whatever you call yourself as a human being, not dealing with our structure that we were looking at, and Dr. King used to put a spotlight on those states that want states' rights, and they didn't want the federal government in. And civil rights division came in and protected the police brutality of people who were brutalized by police. That's not there anymore.
Yeah.
Right. At the end of the day, in Selma, once that federal court gave the permission for the march to
Yeah.
take place, even Wallace didn't block the march from taking place.
Right, because those federal.
Right. But the
Agencies
question
that
today
march.
if a federal court gives permission. Just like if a federal court says somebody needs to be brought back from El Salvador, what would happen today? And so there's some real challenges.
Chief law enforcement officer won't allow it.
Right.
I don't want to make sure, like you just said, Selma, the same people that beat Dr. King on Bloody Sunday were the ones that protected him on March 21st as they went through.
You mean beat to John Lewis and them? Daddy wasn't there.
I mean, when they beat, on Selma Bloody Sunday,
Yes.
Daddy, he was in church. But the same law enforcement that stopped him, they were deputized and said, now you protect them. So in a revolution, as long as the arm is connected to the federal government, there's no revolution. So you have to make sure.
There is so much that this is such a rich conversation, and the good news is it doesn't have to end here.
Right.
It's going to continue on in this workshop series, and so we want everybody to follow the King Center. To get more information, follow Black Voters Matter at Black Voters MTR on all of our socials, and be looking out for us, because this conversation is going to continue, and we're going to go even deeper.
Yes, definitely. We're looking forward to it.
We're looking forward to it,
And we're looking forward to seeing you.
Yes, we're looking forward to seeing everybody. So we have to wrap up this segment of the conversation, but I have a feeling it's going to spill over, y'all. So
That's right.
So stay tuned. Check us out on the next episode of the podcast. Check us out at the workshops, and as we always say, Black Voters Matter 365.